Greg Mescall here with you. Thanks for joining us for more At Home with USA Water Polo content. This week, if you watched us a couple of weeks ago, we looked back at memorable and great moments in women's water polo history. This week, the focus is on memorable and important moments in men's water polo history. And we start with a look back at the 1980 Olympic Games and the boycott that took place where no USA athletes took part. That includes the men's water polo program. And it's been 40 years since that moment, and we're joined by two athletes that were members of that team, Hall of Famers for USA Water Polo, Peter Schnugg and Chris Dorst, and we may also be joined by fellow Olympian Terry Schroeder. But guys, appreciate you joining us here today. I know that even 40 years later, this is still a painful memory, and an opportunity that didn't get to happen for Team USA, and what was a very good team, and what was the start of a decade that was excellent for USA men's water polo. Peter, I'll start with you. Just kind of take us back to that lead up. If you're talking late 70s, 1980, when did you start to get the sense that these games might be in jeopardy for Team USA?
Well, I think it really started to gain some momentum following the State of the Union address by Jimmy Carter in 1980. I think it was the end of January. He was responding to the fact that the Russians had invaded in Afghanistan and was trying to formulate some sort of response, and went through a number of different things and mentioned possibly boycotting the Olympics. And my recollection is that nothing really stuck after that speech, except for the notion that we might boycott the Olympics. So none of the other remedies that he was contemplating to respond, had any kind of momentum, except we'll show them, we just won't show up. So sadly, being politics, it gathered some steam.
Chris, to give some context for the USA men's national team at that time, so the team bronze in 72, then does not qualify for 76. What was the expectation of that group going into 80? Can you paint a picture of the level of success, a world ranking, where the team was at, and how they felt they would do if given the chance to compete in the Olympics?
Well, sure. We were good. We were certainly podium. I think we felt pretty strongly we were gold medal contenders. But you have to understand, at that point for U.S. water polo, up until that point in time, every Olympic team had been essentially a club team with a couple of guys added on. And after 76, and again, Pete could talk through this because he may have been the best player in the country in that, in the mid 70s time frame. So I'm sure it was a little bit more painful for him than for others. But when we didn't qualify for the 76 games, I think U.S. water polo came together and says, no, we have to get the best athletes out there. We have to create an all-star team, which led to the fact that, well, you sort of have to train together on a regular basis. Where do you have a training center? How do you logistically bring people together, whether it's weekends or, some sort of centers of excellence in certain parts of California during the week. And it really created the process that exists now, where you have really the best athletes from the best programs in the country and something of a feeder system with a junior team.
Peter, can you speak to that change that took place after 76, leading up towards 80?
Yeah, we let's see, I got involved probably 71 and was training with the team. Didn't make the 72 team, which was a very good team, and got a bronze medal. But we changed coaches pretty much every year. And the way the national team coach was picked was based upon who had won the nationals the year before. And the nationals at that point in time were different than the way they are now. The club teams were very strong. There were probably 4 or 5 really good programs. and it was a hard-fought competition to win the nationals. That's how the national team coach was picked. So necessarily, the coach didn't really have an opportunity to develop a lot of players to come up with new systems. He ended up picking a lot of his own players because they already knew what he wanted to do, and then added in some of the best players from the other teams. That formula didn't work out very well. There was a lot of issues going into the 76 qualifying, and I think suffice it to say that that process was almost as bitter as the 80 boycott, in that back then there was only one referee, and it seemed like we ran into a little bit of a buzzsaw when it came to the refs. And so following not qualifying in 76, USA Water Polo decided that it was best to have a national team coach and to let that coach develop the team over a quadrennial period. That's when Monty was picked to head the team. Picked Ken Lindgren as the assistant coach, and at that point in time, we had a pool of probably, in any given year, 20 players together on weekends. Maybe once a year or twice a year, we came together for a week or 2-week training camp before heading overseas to go play in our events. And it took a little while for that to sink, but it eventually did. 78, Terry Schroeder and Kevin Robinson joined the team. We went from being top 5 in the world to top 2 when those guys joined. And we had lost, I think, in the finals to Yugoslavia in the FINA World Cup in 79. So we were feeling very good about our chances in 80.
Chris, as this changes, and you were talking about, Peter being on the team earlier and then you coming on later, but you certainly knew the history of the game, that the way a roster was picked had changed. Now it was a much more collaborative process. You had coaches in place. What was there a vibe? For me, not having been a part of that era, I would guess there was a sense of like, we're doing it the right way, and now we're getting the appropriate results. Chris, what do you remember about kind of the confidence of that group as they had now been able to pick maybe the most deserving roster to come together?
Well, I don't know about deserving, but when we'd go into practice, and there were really good players at every position, and so you saw the talent. And the other thing that was happening in that era was not only went from one referee to 2, but they brought the shot clock from 45 seconds to 35, which fed right into our team speed. And the fact that we had guys, Pete at the time was a big dude, but he was a driver. He kind of created the position of the power driver that, most of the guys on the team now are his size. But we brought a different way of looking at the game, a lot of up-tempo, a lot of counterattack, a lot of movement. That the game traditionally had been very vertical. The Eastern European teams had been, big dudes, not very mobile, but boy, they could certainly hold position. And then when they needed to get up and down the pool pretty consistently, it didn't play into their strengths, and it maximized ours. What was fun about that era was seeing guys coming in who were really good players, who might have been, 18, 19, 20 on the roster list, and thinking, man, I got to show up with my A game every single day, because there weren't any days off, number one, and number two, with the exception of guys like, Pete and maybe Eric Lindroth and John Spencer, said there weren't a whole lot of locks for making that team. So I just remember every time strapping it on, just, getting kind of butterflies almost just for practice, because it was not easy, but it was a lot of fun competing at that level.
So as we progress into 1980, and Peter, at the beginning, you kind of set the tone for the news and how this Olympic boycott is picking up steam. Just to kind of advance that a little bit further. So as I gather you're still preparing and training and getting ready to go. does it continue to just roll along? Where is it like 1 week you're hearing it might happen, then no, it's not? What's the memory there as this potential idea of a boycott continues to pick up steam?
It's actually relatively vivid. I guess I was fortunate because at the time I was our team's rep to the Olympic Committee, and the Athletes Advisory Council at that time was a relatively new group, and we had a decent sized voice in the press and in the water polo world for sure, but in the national press as well. But what happened was that the Olympic Committee came out and did their best to try and fight momentum. But then you may recall what happened at the end of February in 1980 at the Winter Olympics. That was the Miracle on Ice. And it was, I think, probably the high point of all of our expectations that we were going to be able to go. After we beat the Russians, it was, let's go beat them, let's beat them on their own turf. And we actually thought that there might be a chance that the sentiment would turn in our favor. Unfortunately, the president doubled down, and we just, we didn't know how to fight that battle. The Olympic Committee did the best they could, couldn't fight the battle, and eventually were overwhelmed by, the national politics. So it was probably mid to late April, I think, when the vote not go took place. And from the end of January till the middle of April, there were a number of different ways we went about trying to counterbalance what the government was saying. But at the end of the day, it just, it was a couple of high school kids trying to compete against the NBA. I mean, it just, we were out of our league, and rest is history.
Chris, when that vote comes down, when the final word is made clear, is that a moment where the team is gathered? Is it a phone chain? How is everyone finding out about this?
Well, I think we were at practice and we kind of got the word, but that was the USOC's official vote. And up until that point in time, we'd all been kind of holding out hope that someone's going to wise up, someone's going to come to their senses, someone's going to make the determination. It was all a bluff, and that we'd end up going. I remember, again, Peter was our rep to the USOC, but he couldn't go back to Washington, D.C. It was like mid-March when Jimmy Carter invited athlete reps from every sport back to Washington, D.C. to have a dialogue with him. And so, thanks, Pete. I paid for the plane trip back and represented U.S. water polo. I remember we went into the White House in anticipation of this dialogue, and Carter got up and said, "Here's why you're not going." And then Ziggy Brzezinski said, "Here's why you're not going." He pointed out stuff on the map. And then Lloyd Cutler said, here's what, so all his minions were basically, you need to understand that, why this isn't happening. And so it was at that point in time when the light started to dim a little bit, at least from my perspective, that, and then again, when the vote happened, this was politics 101, right? I mean, we're just kids playing a sport, and the USOC, you're thinking, has at the back of their mind, it's all about sport. It had nothing to do with sport. And we, as Pete said, we ended up getting into the ring in the heavyweight division when we were trying to figure out how to tie our shoes, and we got pummeled.
So, Chris, you're at the White House for this quote unquote dialogue, but that's not really what went on. But the official word does not come down until, say, a month later. Peter, is that what you recall?
Yeah, actually, I think what happened was that we had the vote. It took the place over about 2 days. were 3 speakers in favor of boycotting, 3 speakers against boycotting. The last man to speak was a guy by the name of William Simon, who at one point he was a well-connected politician, very successful businessman, and a international caliber swimmer, I think. And he gave the final speech. It was very impassioned, very good speech. But when it was over, it was still pretty clear the way the vote was going to go. And so we voted. Back then, you know, there was no email, there was no texting, there was no social media, there was no nothing. And our team, Chris, and the rest of the guys were, I believe, in Canada, headed to Europe for a tournament. And myself and Shaw, there might have been one other person. I don't know if Sayring was there or not, but there were at least Burton and I were there. And when the vote happened, I don't know, I got on the phone and called Canada and gave them the news. And we left from the meeting and met the team in Europe and had to play in a tournament over there. You know, it was supposed to be the kind of the kickoff of our preparation fall, and we ended up going over there and laying an egg. And you know, it was a long trip. It was a tough trip.
Chris, if you think back on that moment, right? You're with the team. Everyone kind of finds out. I mean, does someone try and is it one of the coaches? You know, you, someone else? Is someone trying to say something to? I mean, what do you say in that moment, right? The thing you've been working towards now has been taken away. Do you remember any words that were shared at that point, besides maybe some expletives?
No, there were 1 or 2 of those. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I was kind of a rookie on the team, so it was far be it for me to have been the guy to stand up and say something. I remember, you know, Monty sort of sludging through something. Again, Pete, I recall, was, I don't know if he actually got up and said anything, Pete, but I think he went from guy to guy and you know, let's do our best. I was frankly just so excited to be competing, you know, with a USA t-shirt that, you know, it hit me and you sort of got the sense that, you know, something momentous had been happening, but it was still new enough that for me, it was kind of, well, you know, gee, I'm a young buck. I got some time in front of me. They're not going to have this Olympics. I'll just go to the next one, which, you know, 4 years is a long time. But for somebody like Peter, again, probably the most dominant American player of the 1970s, missed 76 because the team, you know, laid an egg, and 80 got swept out from under him. It had to have been hard.
Yeah, I can't imagine. You know, Peter, I thought of you when we were talking with the women's water polo teams 2 weeks back, and Maureen O'Toole, Brenda Villa were talking about these athletes that never got their chance. They were excellent, right? They're top of their game for the 80s and 90s, and they keep hoping that the Olympics are going to include women's water polo, and they do it as a demonstration in 84 and think, well, certainly 88 will have it. And then they get to 92 and they think, well, it's going to be in Atlanta. Certainly they'll have it in 96. And people's windows opened and closed before they got the chance to do it. I have no doubt this was a painful moment for you. How are you able to process it then as you have years to reflect on it? How do you think about it now, where just for weird circumstances, really beyond your control, it just didn't happen for you?
Yeah. Well, it was painful. It took a while to reconcile, I have to admit. It was a rude introduction to the way politics works, and at least I knew exactly what I didn't want to be involved with the rest of my life at that point. But I had, like I said, I got involved, I think in 71, trained with the team for a couple of years, finally made the team in 73. You know, we were good, we weren't very good, then we got real good. I mean, it was a great journey. It was a great journey with some great guys. Played in 2 or 3 world championships and a couple of Pan American games, and had some great success. And so you know, I did everything but go to the Olympics. And, you know, it's a hole. It's definitely a hole in my heart, but it was not because of anything that I did or had any control over, which is a little bit of a consolation, but it still is. I would have loved to have represented the country at the Olympics. I would have loved to experience that. I would have loved to have been there with all the other athletes, and I miss having that.
Chris, you got the chance, as you alluded to. You had time ahead of you. You know, one of the younger players in '80. You get to go in '84. I was struck by the conversation, again, to refer back to some of the women talking, but people like Maureen O'Toole and Heather Moody and Julie Swell talking about that when they got on that podium and they got a silver medal, it was for them, but they couldn't help but think about kind of representing the people that came before them, and you know, all the women that put in the time and didn't get the chance, and that medal was a little bit for them. You know, not to try and write a movie script here, but was there any part of you on the podium in '84 that's thinking, I'm glad we did this for the guys that helped build it 4 years earlier?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, there were a bunch of guys on that '84 team who went through what we went through in '80. So it's not like you had to remind anybody. You know, I'll never forget walking into opening ceremonies in '84 and seeing some of the biggest, baddest, toughest guys on our team crying like a baby. But me too, right? But just bawling our heads off because, you know, we'd finally gotten there. You have 100,000 people chanting USA, USA, you know, playing our games at, you know, Pepperdine, for goodness sake, right? It was all pretty magical, but it was, you know, Pete wasn't there. Steve Hammond wasn't there. Guys who were pillars of the team for the previous 10 years, all of whom, you know, we played with and sweated with and gone through all sorts of stuff with. So, yeah, it was very much a vindication of the program, an acknowledgement that, you know, we stood on some pretty broad shoulders to get there. And I think the program's built on that really since in the last 40 years.
We're talking about the 1980 Olympics boycott with two USA Water Polo Hall of Famers, Peter Schnugg, Chris Dorst. If you're just joining us here, we're reflecting on 40 years. And look, if you joined our talk at this point, you know this was a painful moment. It still is a painful memory. The point here is to educate, right? This current generation, unless you've kind of dipped into the history books, you know, it might be a thing you never heard about or had to talk about or learned about. This year's postponement maybe gave the 1980 Olympics a little bit of a boost in the memory banks, because it is mildly similar in that it's an Olympic game or an Olympic dream deferred, at least for 1 year, hopefully not longer for our current athletes. Peter, I asked you this not to keep picking at a scab here, but just because I think it's important people know about this group and what you guys gave up that was beyond your control. But Chris talked about those Olympic Games in '84. What was your journey after '80? Did you look to keep playing, and then when that group does do what they do in '84, it has got to be as bittersweet gets. It's your brothers there winning, but you're not a part of it.
Yeah. Well, I had intended to retire all along. I had back then we did a lot of training on our own during the week. We came together on weekends to work out, and then once or twice a year we'd come together for a camp. So after '76, I had come to the conclusion that I better have a contingency plan. So I ended up going to graduate school. I had gotten out of graduate school in 1979, postponed looking for a job until the Olympics. And when we didn't go, I resumed that search. I ended up getting a great job. I was very fortunate. Got married, and yet still in 1981, I was thinking about it. But my life had come together pretty well. And I was very happy, and I ended up making the decision that I probably didn't have it in me to continue to train the way you'd need to train to stay at that level. And so I stayed out, and I was really happy for the guys. I'm glad they got to go. I'm sorry the Russians didn't show up, so we could have kicked their ass then. But I was really happy for the guys. I mean, they were good, and maybe the best team. And it just was as the Olympics go, maybe one game it wasn't their day, but on paper it might have been the best team in the world.
Yeah, that's interesting memories there, and understandably so when you talk about the training, because you talk to even a water polo player that retired yesterday, and it's not that they don't want to keep playing the games and not that they don't want to keep being around the guys, but it's can they put in the required training to be at the level you need to be at to play at that level. And that's usually what drives anyone out of this sport at a high level, is because you have to train, as you both know, at such a high level to compete and to make those rosters. Speaking of which, and we're talking about this a bit offline, right? For the modern day fan, they might be wondering, well, wait a minute, he mentioned the Winter Olympics and then the Summer Olympics. So back then, Olympic Games in the same year, and then you mentioned the team, and the current fan might say, well, how do you know you were an Olympic roster athlete without an Olympic Games? But Peter, you were talking earlier about that trip to Washington, D.C., and Terry Schroeder, who wanted to join us today but couldn't make it at the moment, has told a story before about having to shake the president's hand. And maybe, Chris, you have a similar memory of shaking Jimmy Carter's hand with authority when it was time to kind of receive your honor. Peter, what do you remember about that and kind of the way the team was acknowledged?
Well, it actually was a really nice event. And I'm not sure who paid for it all. Maybe the government did, maybe the USAWP, but the entire Olympic Committee and their families, entire Olympic team and their families were invited to Washington, D.C. for a weekend of ceremonies and events. And there was a introduction of all of the teams on the steps of the Capitol. There was a picnic on the White House lawn. There was a play we went to, Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I even remember what it was. But they set aside the whole theater for the team. There was a big event, fireworks event one night, and it was really nice. But part of the ceremony when we had the picnic on the lawn at the White House was all of the teams were invited up to get their president. And my recollection is that it was a sparsely attended photo session.
Yeah.
I don't remember. I watched it for a little while. I don't remember if there were any teams that actually went up in full to have their picture taken. So there still were some pretty hard feelings about it at the time. And they had also given us a ceremonial gold medal. And we kind of go, okay, well, thank you, but and it was nice for our families. It was nice to see all the other athletes. It was nice to be all together, but it wasn't the Olympic Games. It was,
it's funny, Pete, that gold medal is actually a congressional gold medal that they give to astronauts and heroes and folks. So there are only so many people in the world who have these things, which is kind of an odd story in itself. But I remember from that night, we were all dressed up in our Olympic uniforms, right? Blue jeans, long sleeve cowboy shirts, white cowboy hat, white cowboy boots, which fit in perfectly in Washington, D.C. in the middle of the summer. But I remember getting the opportunity to go to the White House, and I remember Drew McDonald and I just said, that's a bunch of crap. We went to a pub and had a burger and a beer and met up with everybody at the event afterwards. And, the last couple of years you hear stories about athletes who want to go to the White House or don't want to go to the White House. It's this huge, a huge thing about, I can't believe you don't trust the president, you don't respect the presidency. And I thought, well, I don't have much of a leg to stand on if I'm going to be throwing somebody like that under the bus, because I didn't want to go. I didn't want to shake his hand. I didn't feel like, I'd already been to the White House a couple of months earlier and he'd sort of dismissed us. And I thought, well, we'll kill a couple of hours in Georgetown before heading over to the show later on. And again, we didn't stand out at all in the middle of Georgetown. Trust me, it was easy to blend in.
Chris, you had talked about, because Peter mentioned he retired after this moment. Chris, in your memory, as the page turns to 81, when did it get to a point of where it felt like, okay, now we're back to being a water polo national team and we can pursue the 84 Olympics? Did it take time? Was there some trepidation from guys to kind of jump back into the mix after the heartbreak they'd been through?
Well, that's a good question. I can't answer that. I took a page out of the Peter Schnugg playbook. I went to business school for a couple of years and had pretty much retired, right? I'd made it as far as I could make it. This is, my body, even at that age, was starting to break down, right? And so once I'd gotten, my graduate degree and there was an opportunity to come back, it just kind of gnawed at me. And I thought, I might have something left in the tank. And so I missed that year and a half where guys might have had to go through that. They took some pretty cool trips, but I think that allowed a number of much younger guys to kind of come up and take some trips with the national team and really develop a much broader base of, potential national team athletes. So I took a year and a half off and then had a very painful reintroduction to the sport, but things ended up working out.
So 40 years since that time, Peter, as you think back on it, what, you talked about it earlier that it was, it left a hole. It took time to kind of gain some, I guess some different perspective on it. As you think back on it now, 40 years later, why is it important for people to know about it? What would you like the modern day water polo fan to know? The person who loves Team USA and roots for them at the Olympic Games now, why is it important that they know about the journey that you all took 40 years ago?
Well, I think probably the most important takeaway is that the journey is the reward, and the ebbs and flows of what happened over the previous 10 years and the previous Olympics. It would have been phenomenal to play in the Olympics and get a medal or win a gold and participate. But I had those 10 years before. And I think that's the thing. I never set my sights on the Olympics. I set my sights on making the team the next year. And if you didn't look over your shoulder and you didn't worry about that, you usually got left behind. And so the constant nature of trying to become better, trying to be part of a group that gets better as a group, in addition to myself improving my own skills, that's really the reward. And nobody can take that one away from me. I have that, and I'll always be grateful for that.
Chris, as you think back, and most any water polo player, the teams they've been on, as Peter alluded to, right? It's about the journey. It's so often about the trips, the camaraderie. But that 1980 group must have some kind of special bond. When you think back on those guys, and it's been 40 years, and this doesn't take anything away from the 84 team or other teams you've been on, but what is it about the guys that went through that experience? What do you think the bond is like? How would you describe it among that 1980 team?
Well, I think there's kind of a shared sense, like Peter was alluding to, that we'd all been through something pretty interesting, pretty unique, sort of a footnote in history. But as I look back on that team, I don't think anybody in today's game, very few people in today's game realize how good that team was. Like Pete said, we came from nothing to being a dominant international team. And if you look at the people on the team, some of the best players in the United States history, guys that, Peter Schnugg out of the 1970s. We had Eric Lindroth and Terry Schroeder at 2 meters. We had Steve Hammond in the goal. We had guys playing defense like John Seaman and John Svensson and Drew McDonald. We had Gary Figueroa and Kevin Robertson and Joe Vargas as dry. I mean, if you look at the individual pieces of that team and what they meant, what they meant in history, you have people today going, Gary Figueroa, the things that, he was able to do with the ball. Steve Hammond, probably the best goalkeeper in the world in the 70s. That defensive back line, they were big, they were fast, and they were tough dudes. We could go toe-to-toe with anybody and play pretty much any style of game and do pretty well. So you love hearing people say, well, that team from 92, that team, no, I'll roll out that team from 1980 at our peak against just about anybody. And despite the fact that players are 2 feet taller and weigh another 80 pounds these days, I think we'd have given them a run for their money. It was just a really, really good team that got good quickly and gained some tremendous confidence in, the 3 or 4 years previous to 1980.
Really, really appreciate you guys sharing all these thoughts and memories to kind of end on a bit of a lighter note. But this week is all about, the memories of men's water polo. And later this week, we're going to talk with the 2008 group that got back to the podium 20 years later, talk with a guy that you both know well, Craig Wilson, just about the 84 and 88 games. Peter, you didn't play in the other games, but obviously you're still a fan, still supporting the team, still actively engaged in water polo. For the person who wasn't alive yet or they don't remember, like what was it like to be around supporting USA men's water polo in the 80s? That's kind of the era we describe as like the golden era right now, right? Silver, a very good 80 team, silver in 84, silver in 88, could play with anybody. What do you remember about just kind of the respect that team garnered around the world and why it was fun to kind of watch them and cheer for them?
Yeah, I don't know. It was fun. It was a fun time. Our teams were good and we were consistently good, and we were always competing at the highest levels. And I don't know what changed and when it changed, because I got a little preoccupied with work and family as time went on. But it was pretty exciting. I actually was a little jealous because it also, at that point in time, they I think were able to develop better ways to train and be able to spend more time together to develop the teams. It wasn't necessarily training on weekends, sleeping on your buddy's floor, going 15 hours over the weekend for training, to train, and then going back home and trying to stay fit on your own. I think it evolved into a much better run program, and I was jealous of that. So it was fun. I mean, it was fun. Made it more fun because I knew most of the guys. It was a little hard to believe as it got later in the 80s that some of the guys that were on the team were actually on the team, because I remembered them as being kind of little pipsqueaks. But, I'm like Chris. I'm sort of glad I came when I did, because guys just kept getting bigger and stronger and faster, and I'm not sure how I would have fared later on. So it was fun to watch.
Chris, I feel like I've heard you give some similar self-deprecation that you're glad you got in when you did, because there were so many other talented players around. But you were on the 84 team. You certainly knew well what was going on with 88. I know you were involved in broadcast in the late 80s as well. Just your memories of what was a strong program year after year, even into the early 90s, right? Just to win away from the podium again in Barcelona.
Well, I think a couple things. Number one is that the teams of the early 80s really set the bar, right? This is the level at which we can compete. Before that, people were saying, gee, U.S. is going to have a bunch of plucky little athletes, but at some point they're just not going to be able to compete with Hungarians that are 6'7", 6'8", 6'9", and who are just bigger and stronger and have been playing the game all their lives. Well, they had another thing coming, really, when we came up against them and used our speed to our advantage. But the other thing that's interesting is sort of in historical context. I mean, look at that 1984 Olympic Games. The Olympic Games themselves were in trouble. big trouble. And there were only, I think Los Angeles was the only city that bid on the Olympics and followed through in 80, because, 72, there was the terrorist thing. 76, there was the African boycott of Montreal, and Montreal ended up losing $30 billion or something. 1980 was the boycott year. So 84, the Olympic movement itself was shaky as heck. And so part of being proud of having made that team was being a part of maybe the resurrection of the modern Olympic Games, and bringing in corporate sponsorships and bringing in, sort of modern day operational infrastructure to sort of accommodate what had grown to be, a phenomena that required 20 different venues, as opposed to we're going to put everything right here within about a 3-block radius.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. There was a lot of change there. 84 still goes down as the one that developed a surplus and made a profit, as opposed to the other Olympic Games that would go on to really struggle financially. And you've seen all kinds of reforms in the last couple of years for future bidding to make sure the Olympics don't become something that is nothing but a money loser for cities around the globe. Guys, this was awesome. I really appreciate both of you taking the time. I know this is even 40 years later, not your favorite topic to talk about, but I think it's an important one for fans to know about, learn about, and have respect for that team. The one that didn't get its chance, but as you've alluded to, was really good, and a team that people should know about. So, two Hall of Famers, Peter Schnugg, Chris Dorst, really thank you for your time.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it.